Being a superhuman when you obviously are not superhuman. When I was a student at Free Gospel Bible Institute, a small ultra-conservative Pentecostal seminary just outside of Pittsburgh, one of our teachers made a statement in class one day that was met with immediate and intense rejection from 100% of the students in our class. Now, this particular teacher had made some rather off-the-wall statements before. For example, he had once advised all the women in class that before they agree to marry a man, they should first make sure he is capable of changing the oil in a vehicle, forcing me to admit to the girl I was dating at the time, who eventually became my wife, that I indeed did not know how to change the oil in a car. However, since she did know how, we agreed that we would be okay if we were ever forced to live in a community without a Jiffy Lube. On another occasion, he advised all the future ministers in the class that we should invest in a typewriter, a statement that would have made sense if he had said it to the class of 81 or even 91, but not so much to the class of 2001. He went on to explain that a computer might be a more practical option, but he believed they were sinful and none of us should own one. A statement that was made all the more awkward to me as I sat on the front row of class typing my notes on my laptop. But none of his statements was ever met with such backlash as the day he said to a class of Pentecostal preachers in training that we should never repeat our sermons. A sermon, he insisted, is the message of the hour. It is given to you by God for a specific time and people. You should never attempt to reuse it. Sensing our resistance, he attempted to justify his comments with a metaphor. My wife cooked spaghetti last night, and it was wonderful, he said. But if she gives me that same spaghetti again tonight, it won't be the same. While most of us sat back and absorbed this irrelevant metaphor, one student timidly raised his hand and after being acknowledged by the teacher, responded, but last night wasn't the first time your wife cooked spaghetti, right? And she'll probably cook spaghetti again another day, and you'll eat it, right? As our teacher stood silently, as if he never anticipated that anyone would challenge this really bad analogy, another student chimed in. And what if your wife is cooking for another family who's never had her spaghetti? Why would there be a problem with her preparing the same recipe for them that she prepared for you? Realizing, but unwilling to admit the failure of his argument, our teacher changed the subject and moved on. And all the preachers in training left the classroom that day firm believers in reusing our sermons, a practice that I believed in strongly, both during my time as a Pentecostal minister and since beginning my path to becoming a Unitarian Universalist minister. But my teacher's failed metaphor was not lost on me. Though I disagree with his premise entirely, I think it could hold some merit if it were modified somewhat. For example, if his wife had attempted a new recipe for spaghetti and after serving it to her family, she realized that no one took more than one bite before politely pretending they were full, then upon sampling it herself, she realized this was the worst spaghetti she had ever tasted, I would agree that she should never attempt to reuse that particular recipe for spaghetti again. Likewise, over the years, I've preached a few sermons that I've categorized as bad spaghetti recipes and placed them in my never preach again file. In fact, after becoming a Unitarian Universalist minister, every sermon I ever preached when I was a Pentecostal has now been placed there. But my never preach again file is not only filled with Pentecostal sermons. Few sermons written after becoming a Unitarian Universalist have also made their way into the file. Sadly for you all, I usually make that determination after preaching a sermon for this congregation, because since I preach here every month, I don't have any more repeats for you. There is, however, one sermon that I wrote after becoming a Unitarian Universalist that I had already placed in the Never Preach Again file before I came to know you all, and that I had planned to keep there forever. Then last month, during Afterthoughts, I referenced this sermon that I preached years ago to my home congregation in Savannah. A sermon I never intended to use again because it didn't go over very well. But after Afterthoughts, it remained on my mind. And so I decided to give it another shot. In doing so, however, I found myself significantly altering the recipe, So what I'm serving today, although similar in theme, is not exactly the same as the foul spaghetti I served in congregation years ago. My previously referenced sermon was entitled, "You Aren't Sick, Bill Withers is Superhuman." A title that only makes sense when you know the backstory behind it. When I was 17 years old, during the early part of my junior year of high school, I decided I wanted to be an English teacher. I had toyed with the idea of a career in education, but I had previously never wanted to teach English. But my 11th grade American literature teacher inspired me. When most teachers speak of the teacher who inspired them to pursue a career in education, they talk about that one great teacher. My experience was the opposite. Sitting in my 11th grade class, studying some colonial literature that I don't recall, I distinctly remember thinking, I could do this so much better than her. So after one more year of high school and then a 10-year detour in life in which I became a Pentecostal preacher, I enrolled at the College of Charleston as an English major with a minor in education, all the while thinking of the lessons I endured in American literature and how I would do it so much better. And I did. I love teaching. Even in my current position in which I work primarily with teachers rather than students, I still make it a point to spend time in the classroom and as often as possible to work directly with students. I absolutely loved my time in the classroom. In fact, I will confess to you all something I rarely admit, secrets that I have kept mostly to myself. For many years on my way to work, when I was all alone in the car, I would psych myself up for the day by playing the song "Circus Freak" by Britney Spears, singing along and changing the words just slightly. I'm like a ringleader, I call the shots. I'm like a firecracker, I make it hot when I teach a class. I feel the adrenaline running through my veins, spotlight on me, and I'm ready to break. I'm like a performer, the classroom is my stage. Better be ready, hope you just feel the same. All eyes on me in the center of the ring, just like a circus freak. It was my goal every day to try to take this crazy energy with me, this sort of Pentecostal zeal from my previous life into the classroom. So it was one of the most distressing moments of my career when in the winter of 2012, while in the classroom trying to put on a show like a circus freak, that I found myself unable to finish a sentence without gasping for air. I'd just gotten over the flu, so I assumed that this was a lingering symptom that would soon go away. When it didn't, I told a colleague about my symptoms, and he quickly replied, "Tawes, you've got pneumonia. Go to a doctor." So I went to my doctor, who confirmed that I did indeed have pneumonia, which he treated and instructed me to take it easy on my lungs for at least a month, maybe longer. So I forced myself to teach like my 11th grade American Lit teacher. No forceful debates in which I played devil's advocate to make students think, no dramatic read-alouds to engage students in a text, American Lit just as it was taught to me. During this time of healing, I came across the song "Lovely Day" by Bill Withers. Those of you who know the song know the high point is at the end when he holds the final note in the chorus an extraordinary 19 seconds. So I decided I would know when I had fully healed and it was okay for me to no longer take it easy when I could do my morning sing-along to this song and hold the final note with Bill Withers. Wait for it. Imagine trying to do that. Pneumonia. Morning after morning, I tried, increasing with each day, but never able to hold the note until the end. Each day concluding that I was not quite 100%, still unable to give teaching my all. Finally, after about a month and a half, I found myself reading a text to my students, and as I began to really feel the text without realizing it, I allowed myself to put the feeling and emotion that the text deserved into the reading. Found myself acting out the text and being the teacher I told myself back in 11th grade that I would be. Wasn't until the end of the day that I realized that I'd forgotten to take it easy. So I concluded that despite my inability to hold that magnificent note with Bill Withers, I was okay. Bill Withers was superhuman.
Yes.
My lungs were back to normal, able to do all the respiratory things that lungs could do. In fact, I think my lungs were actually craving a little exercise and tired of easy breathing and low volume. I was fine. I had simply given myself an impossible task and thereby set myself up for failure. Since then, whenever I find myself stressed out and beating myself up because I've set a standard for myself that I can't obtain, I stop to reassess the situation. Sometimes I come up with something I hadn't tried, and I find another way to meet my goal. But there are other times, many times, that I realize there's nothing I'm doing wrong. There's nothing I should try that I'm not already trying. It is then that I tell myself, I may never be able to hold this note, and that's okay. I'm okay. Bill Withers is superhuman. That is the illustration from my sermon several years ago that went over almost as badly as my teacher's spaghetti metaphor. Nevertheless, I feel compelled to try it again because I think it is a message we need to hear. There is nothing wrong with you. You're just not superhuman. As Unitarian Universalists, our second principle affirms our belief in justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Our sixth principle calls us to a goal of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The eighth principle challenges us to actively work to dismantle racism, both in ourselves and within the institutions we're a part of. There's probably no religious institution whose members are more diverse in our beliefs and backgrounds than Unitarian Universalists, but equally as important to us as the diversity of our beliefs are the values we hold in common. You were raised in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. These values were instilled in you throughout your life. If you, like many of us, left another religious tradition, it is likely that you were drawn to Unitarian Universalism because you were seeking a community that shared your core values: justice, equality, peace, and anti-racism. Our beliefs create a desire within us for a just and compassionate world. Our passion calls upon us to create that world, to fight for equality, and to dismantle systemic racism and other forms of injustice. But there's a downside to our belief and passion for justice and equality, and that is the sense of frustration and helplessness we feel when we're confronted with the reality of injustice, racism, and inequality that we can do little, if anything, about. I'm frustrated when I see legislators taking action to prohibit all the wrong things. Laws are being passed that effectively ban curriculum, books, healthcare, transgender athletes, and even drag performances. As an educator and as a parent and as a human being with a conscience, I'm frustrated to see that action is taken to ban everything that does not actually harm our children, to solve problems that do not actually exist, but nothing is ever done in the wake of another mass shooting seemingly every week. When I think about issues I care deeply about, climate change, housing costs, homelessness, the plight of immigrants and asylum seekers, my human compassion makes me want to do something to solve all these problems. But the same humanity that produces my compassion limits my ability to act upon it. I am human, but I am not superhuman. It's natural to feel overwhelmed by the scope of the problems we face, from climate change to systemic racism, from poverty to healthcare inequality. It can be tempting to feel that our individual actions are inconsequential, that we cannot make a difference, or that we're not doing enough. If you feel that way sometimes, I can assure you, you are not alone. Although often falsely attributed to Helen Keller, it was a Unitarian minister, Reverend Edward Everett Hale, who famously said, "I am only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. The something I ought to do, I can do, and by the grace of God, I will." I've heard this quote for years, long before I knew it was attributed to a Unitarian minister, but each time I heard it, the emphasis was always upon the latter part of each phrase. I am one. I can do something. But before I can focus on the fact that I am one and I can do something, before I can focus on what I can do and therefore ought to do, I have to focus on the first part first. I am but one. I cannot do everything. Maybe that should be the first thing a Unitarian Universalist says in the morning and the last thing we say at night. I am but one. I cannot do everything. It probably won't stop us from trying to do everything we can to right all the wrongs in the world, but just maybe it'll keep us from driving ourselves crazy when the world's problems still exist at the end of the day. Reverend Reinhold Niebuhr was a theologian whose work has been noted to have influenced the thinking of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and most notably, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who quoted Reverend Niebuhr in his letter from Birmingham jail. Although esteemed by politicians and activists today, he was not always as highly regarded. Reverend Niebuhr was a staunch pacifist who during World War I was criticized when he served as executive secretary of the War Welfare Commission. He broke from fellow progressives when he didn't challenge World War II and the anti-communism efforts that followed. He was leader of the Socialist Party of America, but he did not lend support to die-hard Marxists. He seems to be a man of contradiction or loosely held convictions, but his motivations are best understood through a prayer he wrote while preaching at a church in Heath, Massachusetts in the early 1930s. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. While Niebuhr was not fighting some of the battles his contemporaries chose to fight, he was working to build the first unions, founding the Fellowship of Socialist Christians and the Union for Democratic Action, taking on a culture of xenophobia, racism, and bigotry against Catholics and Jews, and fighting the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Detroit. I think it's quite likely that what Reverend Niebuhr's critics considered to be a lack of conviction was actually the wisdom that came from knowing that he was but one and he could not do everything. Note that in Niebuhr's famous prayer, he said, "Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change." If I were in Reverend Niebuhr's position, doing the work he was doing while being criticized for all the things he was not doing, my inclination would have been to tell my critics to stay in their lane and stop swerving into mine. My prayer might have been, God, remind my critics that I'm doing what I can. Lord, tell them to worry about themselves. But the prayer that has come to be known as the Serenity Prayer is not focused on my critics, but on myself. You'll always have people who criticize you for the committee you didn't sign up for, the event you couldn't attend, the cause you aren't as vocal about, the battle you chose not to fight. But your greatest critic isn't a person or group of persons who is dissatisfied with your level of commitment. Your greatest critic, and the only one with the power to steal your serenity, is you. It is our own sense of personal duty and responsibility for justice, the very thing that propels us to do good in this world, that can also trouble us to the point that we can do no good for the world. The Serenity Prayer is one we've probably heard all of our lives. I first learned it by reading it on a plaque in my grandmother's spare bedroom. The words of this prayer have become so familiar that they can eventually begin to sound trite, take on a tone of resignation and defeat. Or they can empower us to stop trying to sing the note we were never intended to sing, and instead focus on doing the things we can do. You may have noticed that today's message has a different title than the original title. You're not sick, Bill Withers is superhuman. As I reassessed the sermon I had previously banished from my repertoire, I thought maybe the illustration failed to resonate because I focused too much on Bill Withers' superhuman singing ability, when the point I should have been making is that we are not superhuman. None of us. That even includes the great Bill Withers. Maybe the flaw was the title. Bill Withers was not, in fact, superhuman. He was just a really amazing singer who could hold a note for 19 fabulous seconds. I do not possess musical skills and talent, as you just saw. But I do have other skills and talents, and those are the things I should and will do. Although I am but one and cannot do everything, I am part of a community of like-minded individuals, and together we can do amazing things. Maya Angelou wrote, "If you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude." We are not superhuman, but we can still be superhumans. Amen, and may it be so.